So we now want to introduce Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century philosopher, is truly a watershed moment in the history of philosophy. Because for the first time, he shows us how it is possible for us to have knowledge of the world. And the great obstacle to having knowledge of the world up until Kant has been the idea that subject and object are separate things. The world has been conceived, other than by Berkeley, as an object that exists in itself. The subject is inner, the world is outer. And so we have this representational model whereby something which we call a thing in itself exists in the world and somehow gets known by the mind. It is represented as an idea in the mind. And this idea, if we are thinking properly and our senses are working properly, is presumed to resemble the thing that exists out there. Now, we already saw that Berkeley is already onto the difficulty with this, okay? And Hume, of course, has completely devastated the idea that one thing can be known as the cause of another thing. Even if we were to grant the existence of things in themselves, material substances, I still could not prove that those things were the cause of my ideas, because I'm cut off from them. Remember, Descartes relies upon the goodness of God to justify the idea that if I use my faculties correctly, my idea of the world accurately represents that world. Okay? So let me start with the very general statement that what Kant accomplishes in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is his major work, published in 1789, is to do away with subject-object dualism. For Kant, things in themselves can neither be known to exist, nor can they be known not to exist. He has no problem with the possibility that they do. In fact, at times, it seems Kant says they probably do exist. Okay? But I never have an experience of things in themselves. For Kant, subject and object are not separate. Rather, the objects of my experience are made possible by the faculties of human reason. For Kant, it is human reason itself that makes experience possible. And he attributes to Hume sole credit for awakening him to what Kant calls his dogmatic slumber. That he dogmatically sleptwalked past the idea that it is impossible to establish the principle of cause and effect based on the model whereby subject and object are distinct from one another. For Kant, objects become objects of experience only because of the power of human reason to structure experience in that way. Now let me try to simplify this a little bit. If you have an ordinary, traditional 35 millimeter camera, it is designed to produce an image of the world, a still image. It does not reproduce sound. It doesn't create three-dimensional images. Okay? What it is capable of producing is limited by its structure, what it is designed and capable of producing. Likewise, for Kant, our experience of the world, or you might even say the world itself, as far as we can talk about it, is the result of how our minds are structured to represent it. We experience the world or nature as a collection of objects in space and in time governed by the laws of physics. But for Kant, neither space nor time nor the laws of physics, like cause and effect, are properties of the world as a thing in itself. We do not exist in space or in time. Rather, space and time exist in us. We impose those structures on experience. The structure of my experience of the world, spatial, temporal, and causal, is completely the result of the way human reason is designed to represent it. Whatever the world is like as a thing that exists in itself is completely off limits to the human mind. We never have an experience of things in themselves. Our experience is the world as reason represents it to itself. Now, this idea that the world is constituted, or at least my experience of the world is constituted by the mind and not given to the mind fully fledged, was so radical and novel that none of his contemporaries really understood what he was saying. In fact, they thought that he wasn't saying anything different than Berkeley was saying, that the world is just an idea. Okay? But Kant is not denying the possibility that there are things in themselves. There probably are. But those things, as they exist in themselves, are never the objects of a possible experience. What we experience is always governed by the structures of human reason. So the idea of a critique of pure reason is to show the limits of what reason is capable of knowing. That is what it means to critique. When I critique something, I show the limitations of something. Okay? But this title also intends that pure reason is the subject of the critique as well as the object of the critique. We are critiquing pure reason, but it is pure reason itself conducting the critique. Okay? So this is reason critiquing its own capabilities. All right? Now, what Kant says he's doing is his own version of the Copernican Revolution. Okay? What is the Copernican Revolution? What did Copernicus teach? That Galileo agreed with and was nearly excommunicated for. Up until Copernicus in the 16th century, our cosmology, what today we would call astronomy or theoretical physics, okay, was based on the teachings of Ptolemy, the ancient philosopher. And what Ptolemy taught was that the Earth was the stationary center of the universe, and that the sun moved around us. And to this day, we still talk about the rising and the setting of the sun. But we know that the sun does no such thing as rise or set. The earth rotates on its axis and gives the appearance that the sun is moving. What Copernicus did was to realize that the Ptolemaic cosmology doesn't fit the observations, especially when it came to the orbit of Mercury. It could not explain it. The mathematics didn't work. And so he suggested, rather, that the sun is the stationary cosmological object, and that the earth revolves around it. And this paradigm shift was then able to explain what we call the retrograde motion of Mercury. Okay? We call this sort of enormous change a scientific revolution. Okay? Where an entire paradigm is replaced by another paradigm. And by paradigm, I mean an overarching theory that is employed to explain the particular events that take place. So what does Kant mean by saying that he is going to conduct his own sort of Copernican revolution? Here's what he means. If we go back to Descartes, for example, what explains our ideas of the world is the existence of material substances or objects that exist as real things in themselves, and that truth, therefore, is a correspondence between what I think and what is actually the case. When my idea matches up with the way things actually are, then I have knowledge. So thought, for Descartes, is explained by the way the world exists. What Kant does is to reverse the order of explanation, just as Copernicus reversed the order of explanation from explaining the sun's, or the perception of the sun in terms of the earth, to explaining the perception of the earth in terms of the sun. For Kant, ideas are not caused by things in themselves or objects. Rather, my experience of objects is dependent upon the structure of the mind. Okay? And so, what we're going to do in our reading of the Prolegomena, which was a book that Kant published after the Critique, given its widespread misinterpretation, he wrote a more accessible version, sort of comic book version of the Critique of Pure Reason. And it's plenty difficult itself, okay? But what Kant is saying in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics is that before I can do any more metaphysical thinking, that is, thinking about the way the world really is, as opposed to the way it merely appears to be. First, I must establish the principles that make experience possible. Okay? So Kant's main question is, how is metaphysics possible? How is it possible for us to cognize universal principles and apply those principles to the behavior of objects, which is what Kant means by metaphysics, the application of a universal principle to a determinate object of the understanding, to a particular thing. Okay? So, for example, when I see the chalk goes up and it comes back down, and I say that that perception is explained by the principles of gravitation, I have taken the universal law of gravitation and used it to explain the behavior of the chalk. And that is a judgment in the metaphysics of nature. Okay? So, as in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the Prolegomena, Kant wants to know, how is metaphysics possible? And his answer is that our experience of the world, like when I experience one event as the cause of another event, which Hume said I never can experience, it is simply the result of habit. Okay? Kant says, in fact, we do know that A is the cause of B, because we are able to apply universal principles to particular events. And for Kant, what Hume missed is that those principles, like cause and effect, or the idea of substance that Descartes uses to explain the permanence of the wax as it goes through mutations in its appearance. Principles or concepts, as Kant calls them, like cause and substance and existence, are a priori structures of human understanding, which are imposed upon our perceptions.
So is Kant basically saying if I go in a mental breakdown and I lose logical thinking, like if I grab a hold of a dinosaur, I might not think of it as a dinosaur anymore, but what my mind is telling me what it is. Is that like how I reason with it? It's not a dinosaur anymore, but it's what my mind is telling me.
It is possible for us to make misjudgments about the world, okay? But for Kant, generally, these mistakes in judgment are the result of applying the wrong concept to some perception. Okay? Now, not only are the concepts, like cause and effect, built into the structure of our reason, but so are the forms of space and time. When we perceive an object in space and time, Space and time are not properties of the object. They do not belong to the world. They are forms of intuition, such that anything I perceive is immediately filtered through these forms of intuition. We are put together in such a way as to experience the world in space and time and subject to universal laws. But all of these structures by which we make the world understandable are provided by the mind, not given to the mind in perception. And so nature is not a thing in itself. Nature is the experience of things according to the structures of reason that make experience possible. The laws of nature cannot be derived from perception. Rather, the laws of nature are nothing but the structures of reason that make experience possible in the first place. Okay. So your reading assignment, I believe, is the introduction and the preamble to the Prolegomena.